The Elder Scrolls Online just released their brand new chapter, Gold Road, and we are taking a deep dive into the brand new trial, Lucent Citadel. Since week 1 PTS, and I've been saying this over and over, this is the absolute best piece of content I've seen in ESO to date. And if you want to get a chance to win this brand new chapter for free, comment Lucent Citadel plus your platform in the comment section below. The winner will be chosen on June 8th at 10 p.m. Eastern. Lucent Citadel presents so many unique encounters and some complicated new mechanics. And this video is going to teach you everything that you need to know about this trial in order to be successful with whatever your goals may entail. We will break down each and every ad type and boss with a list and showcase of their mechanics, discuss different various ways as well as the best ways to handle all of these mechanics, and then look at clean examples of every fight in a walkthrough type style so that you can see everything in action. A huge shout out and thank you to Bethesda for sponsoring this video. Without further ado, we have a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. The first set of ads introduces two elite ads, the Skirmisher and the Slasher. An important distinction to make now that we'll talk about a little later is that these are categorized as dark type ads. Neither of these enemies are particularly dangerous. The Slasher has two attacks. Its light attack is called Weeping Slash, and this does apply a pretty gnarly bleed to its target. Its heavy attack is called Butcher, and it's just a standard heavy, nothing special about it. The Skirmisher, on the other hand, mimics the Raider in VKA, replicating some Templar abilities. Spear Thrust is its light attack, and like jabs, this animation does its damage in a cone, and anybody touched is applied with a 20-second bleed, which refreshes each time a target is hit. It's helpful to keep this somewhat faced away from group. Every so often, the Skirmisher will use Spear Throw, thrusting a spear at a seemingly random target, striking a player for up to 12k. It can be a pretty heavy hit. Finally, the Skirmisher will also cast Exploding Spear, mimicking the animation of Blazing Spear, throwing an AoE out onto a player that does about 12k damage on impact, plus stuns any targets hit, leaving behind an AoE that will do a small amount of damage over time if anyone is standing in it. For this first set of ads, you can just bring them to the center and nuke. The next room consists of two slashers, one down the path to the left and the other down the path to the right. As long as everyone in your group runs the same direction, it shouldn't matter if you split tanks here, as if you all run down the right side, the slasher on the left will get confused on the quickest route to the group and eventually be tauntable on the opposite side of the group. We usually send everybody but the main tank down the right and then send the main tank solo down the left and stack in the divot where the paths converge. The third pull introduces the first light type elite ad, the Acolyte. This enemy has quite a few mechanics and creates one of the most interesting ad dynamics we've seen in a new trial to date. The Acolyte has a few basic attacks, Spark being its ranged light attack, Quick Strike being its melee light attack, and Smite being its heavy attack. The Acolyte has a mechanic called Sunburst where it targets specific players at random and launches a big AoE at them, striking the ground a couple of seconds later. The initial hit will deal damage and stun. The meteor then sends out 5 smaller AoEs that spawn in a star type pattern, dealing additional damage to anyone hit, spawning once per second for 10 seconds. The unique mechanics from this elite ad though are both Glimmer and Radiance. Whenever the Acolyte is killed, it will leave behind an AoE that is very small but does a ton of damage. It ramps up very quickly and can easily catch a DD off guard. Any enemy stuck in this Radiance AoE will become immune, signaled by a gold bar. For this reason, any stack involving light ads should not be pixel stacked, but instead be grouped so that the light ads are spread out with any dark ads nearby but not on top of the light ones. So with this pull, for example, in addition to the Acolyte, we get a Skirmisher and a Slasher. We make a kind of straight line stack going group, Acolyte, dark ads. Finally, this Acolyte will also cast Glimmer, which essentially places an extra Radiance AoE on a random target of its choice. This AoE does not animate with any sort of red ring like the Radiance one does, and will still do ramping damage. So you gotta make sure that it's called out and that the group is looking for the beam of light sticking up from the ground. The fourth pull encompasses an Acolyte and a Slasher. Like with the previous pull, stack the Slasher near the Acolyte but not on top of it. Alternatively, you can just focus the Slasher to ensure that it dies before the Acolyte, and then you won't risk the dark ad becoming invulnerable. The damage dealers and healers should likely roll dodge into this pull since the Acolyte is to the far left and will likely get a light attack off on a player here, which can be a one-shot due to how large the aggro radius of this set of ads is and how far from that pull point the Acolyte is situated. The fifth and final main set of ads encompasses a Slasher, a Skirmisher, and introduces the Firestorm. This dark elite ad combines the mechanics of the Butcher seen in Sanity's Edge and the Keel Cutter seen in Dreadsail Reef. Its light attack is called Slash, and it will apply a nasty burning over time effect called Burning Slice. Uppercut is its heavy attack. The mechanic Tectonic Fissure sets 3 fire AoEs in an arc that spread out in the direction the Firestorm was facing during the cast. This arc of 3 AoEs gets more spread out as they spawn further forward, spawning in 5 total waves. These AoEs ramp up in damage for anyone standing in them, as well as apply stacks of darkness, so moving out of them is probably a wise decision. The main mechanic, and usually the burn goal to be aware of, is based around the mechanic Incineration. This mech mimics that of the Keel Cutter, where the target begins swinging his sword around in a circle, creating a swirling firestorm in the form of a growing AoE. Once this channel completes, anyone caught inside will take a very large amount of damage instantly, sometimes enough to even one-shot. This damage ticks once every half second and applies stacks of darkness. And with that, perhaps one of the most interesting ad mechanics we've seen to date, many ads in this trial, especially later on, do some form of dark damage. This specific damage type will apply stacks of darkness, appearing as the same icon as Seething Fury in your buffs and debuffs. These stacks last for over 2 minutes, so unless you are actively avoiding ads that can do this type of damage to you, you'll likely see this a few times. Hitting 3 stacks will inflict you with darkness. This appears as a big black AoE under your feet and does a decent tick of damage on its application that will also hit those around you and apply stacks of darkness to them as well. This means that if a bunch of people are stacked and at 2 stacks, somebody getting hit to trigger their 3rd stack could send out a cascade of damage that just one-shots everyone hit. So darkness spawns with burst damage done in an AoE around you, and that initial damage builds stacks of darkness, but once the AoE is applied, it will do damage over time to you for about 60 seconds, and anybody else hit in your AoE. The ticks from people standing in your AoE do not apply stacks. However, while inflicted with darkness, you get a massive resource drain, and if you're holding this debuff for longer than 10 seconds, you'll simply be at 0 mag and stam, despite the mechanic lasting for an entire minute. This is where those Radiance AoEs come into play. Throughout the trial, you'll see crystals that have those AoEs with a beam of light shooting into the sky, the same way that those AoEs spawn from either the Acolyte's death or its cast of Glimmer. Running into the AoEs will cleanse the darkness debuff from you, as well as restore a ton of resources and offer some additional mag and stam recovery for a short period of time. A super interesting mechanic. The last set of ads that we'll see before encountering the first boss is a small pack of Dremora. Not much here to worry about, just have the tanks keep an eye on the ads that like to run through the hallway and get them aggroed before they have a chance to do so. This brings us to our very first boss encounter, Count Ryelaz and Ziliaset. This is one of the most unique fights that we've seen to date, and the first boss fight since Hellra that forces the group to split up. You'll notice 2 bosses in this room, an Ash Titan boss named Count Ryelaz and an enemy that has come to be known as the Scorpion boss named Ziliaset. The first thing that you'll notice is that these bosses are divided by a mirror-like wall that you can see through. You'll also notice 3 pads on each side of the room, which, when you interact with them, will transport you to the other side. This will become important later. To go ahead and squash any rumors, there are no buffs, debuffs, or damage that can be shared between your group through the wall. This was accidentally possible in early PTS cycles, but was later patched. Damage taken mechanics that the bosses do, however, can go through the wall, though this note is mostly irrelevant. Starting on the Ash Titan side, Count Ryelaz has a long list of mechanics, most of which are irrelevant to be honest. Rend, Swipe, and Slash are all just varying light attacks that the boss performs. Shear is the main mechanic for the group to be aware of, being the boss's heavy attack. Once the boss performs the heavy, a meteor AoE called Gloomy Impact will spawn on everybody in that room, on a staggered timer, impacting the ground 2 seconds after the AoE spawns in on the player. This means that the meteors will land at staggered times. The best way to handle this side, in my opinion, is some sort of an arc stack, so that the DDs are spread out enough to only ever have to worry about blocking their own meteor, as opposed to having to hold block for a few seconds at a time, or roll dodge to avoid their AoE in addition to everyone else's. On regular vet, you only get 1 wave of these meteors, but on hard mode, you get 2 waves, only a couple of seconds apart per heavy attack. Twin Strike Sunder is the last mechanic that the Count does, and this is a 2-part attack. He will first throw a medium attack of some sort at the tank, followed by a blue orb. This orb does cleave and will hit anybody directly in front of the boss's line of sight, as well as do a decent bit of damage. It's not really so bad of a mech that you need to actively avoid being in front of the boss, but worth being aware of to some degree at least. Throughout the encounter, the fight is broken up into 60-second phases, where each boss will cast either Bleak or Brilliant Annihilation. While channeling this ability, you will see the pads near the back of each room suddenly light up, and the boss has become locked in a summoning animation. If you look at the pads on your side, you'll see nothing special. However, if you look across the mirror to the other side, you'll notice one of the pads glowing red or yellow depending on which side you're on. You'll need to go to the pad on your side that matches with what you're seeing across the room in order to successfully swap. A successful swap appears with a tick of damage in logs that reads Bleak or Brilliant Pulse. Failing to go to the correct pad results in an instant one-shot to anyone outside of the safe zone and appears in the death recap as Bleak or Brilliant Annihilation. Any mechanic with the name Bleak is casted by Count Ryelaz, and any mechanic with Brilliant is casted by Ziliaset. We ended up labeling the pads entrance, middle, and exit for the sake of callouts, but entrance, middle, far, or left, right, center should work as well, assuming that the callouts are made facing the mirror for each side. The final component to the flow of this fight are the ad spawns. Each phase again is broken up into 60 seconds on vet and vet hard mode. However, hitting certain percentage thresholds will force a pad swap on hard mode. Throughout these 60 seconds, you will get mini boss and ad spawns on a timer. Once a boss hits 90%, they'll start spawning ads. On regular vet, you'll get the mini boss plus 2 ads once every 60 seconds. But on hard mode, you'll get a mini boss once every 40 seconds and ad spawns every 20 seconds based on that 60-second room swap mechanic. So that means that you should get the small ads at 20, 40, and 60 seconds for each phase respectively. These ads spawn in alternating waves of 2 to 3. One niche contingency to this though is that these little ads can only spawn if a mini boss is alive. So if you kill a mini boss just before one of the small ads are about to spawn, you'll skip the spawn of the small ads completely. I would have to assume because a mini boss doesn't exist to give you the luster beam mechanic to unenrage them, which we'll talk about shortly. The bosses will force the pad swap mechanics at 80 and 35% respectively. As of now, it seems that that's primarily based on Count Ryelaz's health as opposed to Ziliaset's or the total boss health. But there seems to be some prio mechs here and there that make this a little bit unclear. Theoretically, you can skip small ad spawns if you're quick enough throughout this phase, skipping the ads that spawn at 40 seconds if you push these pad swaps in 30 seconds, or skipping the final that should spawn at 60 seconds if you push this in 45 to 50 seconds. Finally, it's important to note that while ad spawns can happen while the bosses are channeling the swap mech, none of the cleave abilities from the mini bosses can be performed, and no mechanics from the bosses themselves can be performed either. Regarding the mini boss mechanics, on the Ash Titan side, you'll get the mini boss called the Gloomy Blackguard. This mini boss's light attack is called Slash and will near one-shot a damage dealer. The mini bosses will always spawn in one of 2 back corners opposite of the mirror dividing the room. For this reason, I suggest each main boss be faced towards the mirrors, so that the tank has the best possible angle on seeing these mini bosses and taunting immediately. Rake is the mini's cleave mechanic, and it comes out quickly. Again, this can one-shot damage dealers, so it's important to have this cleave faced away from the group. The final mechanic casted from the mini is Bleak Luster Beam. The mini boss pauses and performs a channeled mechanic that places 2 red glowing AoEs on 2 non-tank players on the Ash Titan side. These beams put out an AoE around the player that does a small amount of damage to anybody standing in it, and this can stack and catch players off guard pretty quickly. While not detrimental, this is another reason I suggest a somewhat spread out stack for this fight on each side. The main relevance to this mechanic though is for the small ads that spawn in. On the Ash Titan side, the smallest ads are called Bone Flayers. These ads spawn in invulnerable with a gold bar, and the only way to get rid of this gold bar is to take the Luster Beam AoE given to players and touch the Bone Flayers with it. This will remove the gold bar and make them damageable. These ads are completely ranged, which means that they don't stack very well. It's important for DDs to be aware of these ad spawns and take the Luster Beams to the little ads as quickly as possible, since a mini boss has to be alive in order to make them vulnerable. And the Luster Beam timing doesn't always line up with plenty of time to get to the target. These ads can quickly become overwhelming if not dealt with properly. You can deal with stacking these ads in a few different ways. The strat working the best for us so far is to have a healer slot taunt and just range the ads into the boss stack, which, if done quick enough, will even prevent the DDs from having to run out of group to make them damageable altogether. As far as the actual mechs for the Bone Flayers are concerned, they have 2 different light attacks. Spike is the ranged light attack and Slash is the melee one. Rending Slash seems to be a special attack that they do periodically on the aggroed target. Finally, these Bone Flayers will enrage after about 20 seconds of being alive, at which point they will visibly grow in size, slightly increasing their damage done and become untauntable. Note that this looks way scarier than it actually is. The damage increase that they get is very small. They do, however, begin spawning trauma totems to the aggroed player, which is just an AoE that does a little bit of damage but spawns pretty frequently. It's easy to avoid and get out of, but if you don't get rid of these targets when they are enraged, this mechanic can stack up and make stacking on this boss very annoying very quickly. So with that, we now know the entire entire flow of the fight. The general flow of the fight is the same on each side. All that changes on the Scorpion side are some mechanics that each target does. I will say this side of the room requires notably more healing and really good resource management from the tank. Starting with the main boss Zilia set. This boss has two different, for lack of a better word, light attacks that the boss seems to switch between. Sting is the light attack performed by the tail strike, and Twin Jab is the light attack seen from the spinning fist. Focused Ray is a really thin and long cone that spawns from the boss, and this can go through the wall. It doesn't really seem to do much damage even to the DDs though, and can just add a little extra pressure to all the damage that the Scorpion side actually has to put up with if not kept out of group. Its heavy attack occurs in 3 distinct ticks, ramping up in damage with each tick, the final blow being a pretty significant strike and a one-shot if unblocked. The first tick is called Heavy Slash, the second Heavy Smash, and the final Heavy Strike, which ticks for about 15k through block on a tank. This heavy attack ticks over about 5 seconds. Finally, like with the count, this boss's room swap mech is either Brilliant Pulse if the group swaps successfully, or Brilliant Annihilation to anyone performing the mech incorrectly. The mini-boss that spawns in the room is called the Shadowborn Lightweaver. This mini is by far the most challenging part of the fight to tanks. Its light attack is called Slash, and like the Gloomy Blackguard, has a mechanic called Brilliant Luster Beam that targets allies with a yellow beam that does a small amount of damage in an AoE radius and is primarily used to get rid of the gold bar from the little ads on this side. The tank buster from this mini though is a mechanic called Blood Frenzy. This conal attack ticks once every half second for 10 seconds and drains your stamina bar. The damage from the cone when blocked isn't even that bad, but running out of stamina and taking an unblocked hit is a near instant death. Combine this with the triple heavy attack from the boss and you can end up taking 23 blocked ticks in a 10-second window. This also seems to stack some sort of debuff that increases the damage of each hit. Using 2 roll dodges halfway through the spec will reset the stacks. However, this doesn't feel very worthwhile in a tank, mainly because the damage isn't the issue, it's the stam sustain. The small ads in this room are called Gloomy Inferniums. These little buggers can do a lot of damage really quickly and out of nowhere. They have 3 different light attacks, none of which do too much, called Claw, Slash, and Cut when in melee range. Their ranged light attacks are called Scorching Spit. Like the Bone Flayers, these ads do have a sort of enrage mechanic, but it's much more subtle. Melt appears as a fiery beam that attaches to a player of this ad's choice, and it lasts for 40 seconds, ramping in damage over time. If this attack gets its full duration, it will do over 130k total damage, ticking for 8 to 10k with its final hits. Melt will tick once every 2 seconds, and you can track this mechanic via 2 different debuffs that appear on your debuff bar. The first is the 40-second timer indicating that the mechanic is attached to you, and the second tells you how many stacks of melt that you have to indicate how heavily the damage has ramped up. This isn't enough to kill players with good healing, but this in combination with the room's unique source of damage from glass orbs could be enough to randomly one-shot. And with that, the last mechanic to be aware of on the Scorpion side, the glass orbs spawn around the room in random intervals in groups of 2 to 4 at a time, and has an attack called Brilliant Ray, which attaches to a target and does a small amount of damage over 3 seconds. There are up to 4 orbs active at a time, and these orbs can all target the same player if you get really unlucky and do a scary amount of burst damage in a short period of time. Like with the Bone Flayers, I strongly suggest to healers stacking the Inferniums on the Scorpion side, and they have to be stacked really quickly. They will not move while channeling Melt. In addition to this, the tank cannot take aggro of these Inferniums during the actual fight. The extra attacks are too severe on Stam Drain, with the 20 ticks from the Mini Heavy and the 3 ticks from the Boss Heavy usually occurring simultaneously. Getting the extra light attacks from these little ads or even Melt will drain Stam even further, and your tank is sure to die. On that note, another unique mechanic revolving around this boss is the fact that the ads can pass through the mirror. This is largely irrelevant, but is a really cool niche component to the fight. You'll notice that the Gloomy Blackguard, the mini boss, is on the Rakad side, but the Gloomy Inferniums that spawn in gold barred are on the Scorpion side. The Inferniums are gold barred because they're considered dark type ads on the dark side of the room. A really cool trend in this trial is that dark type ads are only damageable in a light environment and vice versa. So for example, if the tank on the Scorpion side is getting ready to port over to the Ash Titan side, that tank probably has aggro of the mini boss, the Shadowborn Lightweaver. If, when they swap, the tank that enters the Scorpion room doesn't get aggro of the Lightweaver quick enough, it will run over to the other side, chasing the tank that does have aggro, and will then become invulnerable because it's a light ad in a light room. The mini boss will remain on the Ash Titan side, and now must be an additional target for the tank on that side to taunt, and will only become damageable when the mini boss on the Ash Titan side comes comes out and gives players Bleak Luster Beam. Again, the red glowing AoE. Taking this dark AoE over the light mini-boss will make it damageable again. Now you can manipulate this mechanic a bit in your favor. If, for example, there are leftover Bone Flayers or Gloomy Inferniums on either side, especially since the boss isn't an issue at this point, you can have the tanks taunt the small adds to bring over to the other side to have the group finish them off. Again, in this example, the Gloomy Infernium is a dark type add, so when it walks over to the Ash Titan side, it will immediately be damageable in the light environment. And if you have your damage dealers facing your cleave towards the wall, those Gloomy Inferniums will walk over without really doing any damage to anybody and naturally walk into the cleave, probably just getting nuked. We'll see this dark versus light trend much more often, especially in the second boss, but it's just a cool little thing to be aware of. The final mech related to these bosses is a bit annoying. Each boss will cast a mech called Brilliant or Bleak Rejuvenation if the bosses are not killed within 10 seconds of each other on hard mode. This occurs on normal and veteran, but the window to kill is much larger. This cast restores the boss's health to about 30%, which can get really tricky and really annoying to deal with very fast. It becomes an endless cycle of one boss dying and the other one reviving as the first is dying, which almost makes the fight a wipe, especially on hard mode with all the mini bosses. You can keep track of the boss's health a few ways, the most obvious of which is to simply communicate. I find that stopping on one boss at around the 5 mil mark is a good threshold, and once the other side is at about 5 mil as well, both sides are good to kill. If you only have a 1 mil difference, you won't really need to pause, but anything more than 2 mil probably requires one side holding off for a second or two. Likewise, you can just make sure that your boss percentages match the total percentage given at the top. So for example, if you're looking at Count Ryelaz and you notice that he's at 10%, but you look up at the top bar, which gives a total of 15%, then you know that the Ash Titan side is way ahead of the Scorpion side, and you should probably hold off for a couple of seconds until the percentage at the very top matches up with Count Ryelaz. When both bosses are low and then the percentages match up, you're good to kill. Now let's take a look at all of these mechs in action with a quick and clean flow of fight example. We're taking a look at this from the tank POV mainly because I feel that this was one of the more challenging fights in the trial to tank, specifically because of the Xillia set and Shadowborn Lightweaver combo. So with that, we'll start on the Xillia set side. As I said earlier, after tanking this a few times, I'd suggest turning this boss towards the mirror. This clip comes from a bit earlier in the progression before we figured out that that was kind of the most ideal way to do it, in my opinion. We get to this first 90% phase here and we can see that we have the Gloomy Inferniums followed by the Shadowborn Lightweaver spawning. This Lightweaver is going to come out to our back right here and he's going to go ahead and give players the Luster Beams so that the Gloomy Inferniums can be targeted very early on, unenraged and focused. We get the Shadowborn Lightweaver in and the boss is pushed to 80% before it even does its AoE cleave mechanic, so it's time to swap pads. We're going to look across at the other side of the mirror, see that it's the right or exit or far pad, and make our way over to the Rakat side. Those ads are unenraged, so they still can be killed over there without the need to get them taunted and brought over to the other side. We're going to get aggro of the Gloomy Infernium and Count Ryelaz here with no ads up just yet, but ready for the next mini-boss spawn coming up shortly. The next mini-boss is up to the top left here, and it's going to be brought in with relative ease. The Bone Flayers are not too far behind, followed by the next heavy attack. We're going to make sure as the tank to call out either heavy or meteors, so the DDs know what to expect. The next set of Bone Flayers is up, and they are going to get stacked quickly. The Luster Beams aren't going to last much longer, so the DDs do take them out of group to unenrage the Bone Flayers just in time. This Gloomy Blackguard is already almost dead. And we do get that final set of Bone Flayers spawning in just before the pad swap, in addition to the other mini-boss. It's time to look across and see that it's the middle pad for the final pad swap here. We should try to get aggro of these Bone Flayers so that they walk across to the other side unenraged, since we only were able to unenrage a couple of them. We're going to enter into the Xillia set side with the Shadowborn Lightweaver very healthy, immediately into the cleave mechanic, and this is where the Stam minigame begins. Those Bone Flayers do make it over to the other side, and they enrage right as they do so, but again, because they're light adds in a dark room and they stack instantly, it doesn't matter. We make it through the Lightweaver's mechanic as he gives the Luster Beams for the next set of Inferniums, and the next Lightweaver is up with not a ton of time to get our Stam back. At this point, though, Xillia set is at 14% and the overall boss health is at 12, so we're pretty close. The Rakat side might need to slow down, but honestly, the meteors on that side tend to do that for us, so we will ignore the ads and just kill the boss at this point. Down to 1 mil on Xillia set. And now just our boss left and killed with plenty of time to spare. On to the next set of ads. This series introduces us to a couple of new ad types. The first main target that you'll notice is the Iridescent. This light type ad mimics many of the attacks of the Acolyte, casting Spark as its ranged light attack, Quick Strike as its melee attack, Smite as its heavy, and applying Radiance, the AoE used to invuln ads, cleanse darkness, and that quickly ramps up in damage for standing in it, whenever the Iridescent dies. We are also introduced to the Skeletal ad type. Funny enough, these low health ads are always the priority, since nearly all of their damage applies stacks of darkness. Darkness is the #1 cause of death during ad pulls in this trial, so getting rid of the ads that easily source it is always the priority. On top of this, the Iridescent casts a mechanic called Return, which spawns a large group of skeletal ads with each cast. The Iridescent will cast Return once every roughly 10 seconds, and there's nothing more annoying than these ads spawning right on top of the Iridescent right as the Iridescent is dying, so that the Radiance AoE spawns before you even have a chance to kill the skeletons. The ads are annoying to chain and do a ton of channeled abilities to prevent them from easily being pulled out of Radiance, so failing to kill them before the Iridescent can pretty dramatically extend the time that you spend on any given trash pull. And with that, there are 4 types of necrotic ads. The Skeletal Stormfront casts Shock, its light attacks, as well as Thunder Thrall, which is a mech where the Stormfront ports to an ally and channels a big shock AoE. Getting hit will apply stacks of darkness. The Skeletal Shadowcaster will cast Magic Dagger, its light attack, and Shadow Slice, where it will disappear and port to a random player, reappearing and doing dark damage. The Skeletal Necrotic is likely the worst of the pack. Entropic Flare is its light attack, and it has an interruptible cast called Void, which shoots out 8 Void AoEs over 6 seconds that explode into 3 smaller ones that spawn in a triangle pattern from the giant Void AoE. Getting hit by any of these attacks will apply stacks of darkness, and it's this mechanic that leaves you most likely to get stacks at all. Finally, the Skeletal Ravager just does Quick Strike, its light attack, and Uppercut, its heavy, which, if unblocked, will stun. So with that, this first pull is pretty simple. Make sure that all of the small ads are chained and focused down, with all cleave being centered on the solo Iridescent. Keep in mind that the Iridescent can only cast Return on dead ads. So if you want to avoid this mechanic being casted altogether, you could theoretically chain all of the small ads away from the Iridescent and pull the Iridescent away from any ads that it might be near so that it can't cast Return at all. The next pull encompasses 2 Iridescents and an Acolyte. Funny enough, for some reason, the Acolyte is not currently affected by Radiance, which means that when a light ad dies, if an Acolyte is in the Radiance AoE, it will still be damageable. I'm not sure if this is intended or not, but for now, that makes the priority the Iridescents, and you want to try to make sure that they aren't stacked too close to each other so that one doesn't invuln the other when it dies. As long as the Acolyte dies last, it doesn't matter if this one ends up stacked or not. I recommend going behind this pillar to get the ads stacked in a straight line and let your arcs cook them with Pragmatic. The next ad pull isn't really a full pull per se, as we are introduced to a solo Ice Atronach. The Ice Atro can't reliably be brought to the previous or the next pull, mainly due to its teleport mechanic. This mech seems to occur when the player with aggro gets too far away for its ranged light attack, but it A, has a cooldown, and B, doesn't reliably port to the player with aggro. It seems relatively random if you try to take it to the previous or next rune, so I'd suggest simply killing it here. This ad's melee light attack is called Crystal Spear, its medium attack is called Crunch, and its heavy is called Batter, which applies Hindered and Rattled, a heal check and Maim when blocked, Seethe, which enrages the Atro if dodged or outranged, increasing its damage done by 60%, or Devitalized, which reduces armor and increased damage taken if unblocked and survived. Finally, the Atro does a mechanic called Shard Eruption, where it stops in place and begins spewing shards that hit all players. This mech does a medium amount of damage, not really requiring too much focused healing, but enough to add a little bit of pressure. The next pull encompasses a single Acolyte and Iridescent. Here I think it's best to just pull the 2 ranged ads to the middle of the room. The Iridescent will get there pretty quickly, but the Acolyte will roleplay for a second or two. Again, here focus the Iridescent, since it spawns the small set of ads, and since the Acolyte can be pixel stacked without the risk of it going invulnerable. The next pull is probably one of the more dangerous encounters in the trial. It encompasses 2 Acolytes, a Firestorm, and a Slasher. The priority here is without a doubt the Firestorm. Killing this ad before its Incineration mech is the safest way to handle the pull. In any double Acolyte pull, you'll almost always want to stack the Acolytes on top of each other and any other ad next to them, but not close enough to be caught by Radiance in the event that the Acolyte dies first. I'd suggest one tank grabbing the light and one tank grabbing the dark here, and bringing the left Acolyte to the right one, then stacking both dark ads right in front of the right side Acolyte. This will allow the dark ads to be easier focused right off the rip and avoid the risk of invulning anything. This brings us to the mini boss in the trial. To start this fight, you'll notice a crystal atro and a bunch of skeletal type adds. Surrounding the arena is a series of crystals that rotate around the room, with the radiance AoE around them. These should be used to cleanse the inevitable darkness that will spawn on you and your allies. Again, to control deaths, focus the little adds as a priority here. Once all the adds are cleared, the mini-boss, Kavit Agnin, will spawn in. This mini-boss will be damageable immediately, but will very quickly cast Radiance, where he becomes Gold Barred, spawns more skeletal adds, and channels 2 AoE sources of damage. The first is Afterburn, and this is the giant AoE that you see surrounding the boss. The second is Sunburst, which are the small AoEs that originate from the center. Both of these can be healed through, but they do a decent bit of damage, so while the boss is channeling the mech, this is your time to kill the adds and pre-dot. Note that any add that spawns in this giant circle will be gold barred, so they must be pulled out in order to be damageable. It's also worth noting that the adds only summon from pre-made corpses, so if you want to avoid the adds spawning in with the gold bar, kill the little adds outside of the center of the room before the mini-boss spawns in. This mini-boss does not move a step. He is completely ranged, so if the tank gets darkness, they can cleanse without having to worry. This boss has a ranged light attack called Spark and a melee light attack called Quick Strike. Its heavy is probably the most trolled mech that exists in the game to date. It doesn't do a lot of damage and it has infinite range. It'll hit a tank cleansing darkness at a crystal at the edge of the room. However, if this heavy is either dodged or if it kills the tank, everybody around you will get one shot. It's pretty hilarious. The heavy and any subsequent death from avoiding the heavy is called Smite. Note that, strangely enough, anyone that rolls the heavy will live. So for example, if the tank gets killed by the heavy, but a DPS roll dodges it, that DPS will survive, and anyone who didn't roll will die. This is probably my new favorite mechanic in the game. The last cast that this mini does is called Bleak Quake. The boss slams his staff into the ground and shoots out a few AoEs that spawn in a radius around the mini. Once the mini boss dies, you'll notice a fun little puzzle. There will be a blue ring that you can synergize on, turning you into a wisp. You'll also notice that you get a new skill bar. If you look straight up, you'll see blue and orange orbs floating around the room. Your goal is to make it to the very top, but the catch is that every second you spend in wisp form drains your stamina bar at a rate that calibrates to your max stamina. Having more max stam, for example, won't give you more time. If you run out of stam, you transform back into a humanoid and most likely plummet to your death. The first skill on your bar gives you major expedition for 5 seconds, and the second ability prevents you from losing any stamina for 5 seconds. Once you use both skills, though, they have a pretty long cooldown. Hitting a blue orb will restore a little bit of stamina when you pass through it and eliminates the cooldown for your speed skill. Hitting an orange orb dramatically depletes your stamina and will likely send you straight out of wisp form. Finally, you'll notice a bunch of different platforms around the room as you make your way up. These platforms have the same blue circles seen at the beginning of this mechanic that you can either sit in to fully refresh your stamina or pause and transform out of wisp form and then take the synergy to go back into it with full stam. Note that when you make it to the top, your ult will be restored to 500. This is very helpful for the next pull. The easiest way to do this mech is to hit your shield and speed buff immediately, then simply go to the highest platform that you can reach without touching an orange orb, let your stam run out, wait for a few seconds so that your speed buff is off cooldown, then hit the synergy again plus speed buff and get to the top. There should be a couple of blue orbs to hit along the way if you need some help. If you want a challenge, you can try to take the blue orbs all the way up, constantly refreshing your speed buff as you pass through each orb and getting to the next before it runs out. You have to move very efficiently to do this, and it's almost certainly not worth doing for the no death, but can be very fun to try. There are only 2 more ad packs in the entire trial, and both of these are quite the beast. Luckily, everybody starts this pull with 500 ultimate after finishing the Wisp mech. You'll see 2 Acolytes, a Firestorm, a Slasher, and a Skirmisher. Following the rules of the previous pulls, we will pixel stack the Acolytes and put the Dark Adds just in front of them, with the group's focus being the Firestorm. The Dark Adds are very spread out, which makes keeping the Firestorm at the point of origin very difficult. For this reason, we will meet the Firestorm in the middle, stacking the dark where it ends up and pulling the 2 Acolytes towards the stack, stopping right behind our stack point. I strongly advise ult dumping this pack. After the Firestorm and Slasher die, we will be introduced to the final ad type in the trial, the Radiant. This elite light type ad spawns from the crystals that you see to the left and to the right when we start the pull. Like the other light ads that we've encountered thus far, the Radiant will mimic the attacks of the Acolyte and Iridescent with one bonus mechanic. The Radiant will cast Spark for its ranged light attack, Quick Strike for its melee, and Smite for its it's heavy. It will also cast Return, spawning skeleton-type adds that deal dark damage from pre-existing corpses. Their unique mechanic occurs when they break free from the crystal, spawning by casting Radiance, exactly mimicking the style and damage of the Radiance mechanic from the previous mini-boss. That means that these adds will be invulnerable to start. They are a bit annoying to stack as they are very heavily ranged, and do leave behind the invuln AoE once killed, so you don't really want to pixel stack them anyway. You can either split the group 6 and 6 to pre-dot and kill, or you can kill one and bring the other one close by to start damaging once the first one is dead. The choice is yours, and these adds on their own aren't really too dangerous as long as they're taunted and as long as the adds that they spawn die quickly in order to avoid group members catching darkness. If you leave this pull with darkness, don't stress, there is a crystal 2 rooms later with the Radiance AoE active to cleanse on. And that brings us to the final add pull of the trial. Here we will have 2 acolytes, 2 firestorms, and a slasher. You'll also notice that the adds surround one crystal in addition to there being another one in the previous room. That's right, once you finish the adds you see, 2 Radiance will spawn in. This is probably the most dangerous add pull in the trial since there are 2 firestorms, and especially since they start in the very back. It's best to save your ults until these adds walk in, as they tend to like to do channeled casts like Tectonic Fissure before fully making it to the preferred stack point. I suggest stacking the 2 acolytes together as always, this time on the left one, and bring the slasher and 2 firestorms to the front or to the left side of the acolytes. Ulti dump when the firestorms get in, and simply be ready to move out of the incineration mechanic. Again, it's extremely important to make sure that the dark adds don't end up in the Radiance AoEs either from what will likely be the dead acolytes or from the Radiance AoE coming from the crystal in the center of the room. Once this pack dies, you can again either split 6 and 6 to go take on the Radiance, or have the group kill one in the middle of the room while a tank brings the Radiant from the previous room to the group. Keep in mind, if you choose to focus them one at a time, the Radiant from the previous room will de-aggro if the tank goes too far, too fast. While killing these Radiants, make sure that the small adds that they spawn die as a priority to avoid taking stacks of darkness. If you kill both Radiants and do not cleanse darkness, you're stuck with the dark AoEs until they expire here. Likewise, killing a Radiant with small adds still alive runs the risk of those small adds becoming invulnerable if they are too close to a Radiant when the Radiant dies. So for the sake of speed as well, it's best to just nuke these as soon as they spawn. And now on to the second main boss, the Orphic Shattered Shard. You'll notice that when you first enter the room, you're confronted with 2 Crystal Hollow Sentinels and some Crystal Atronox that seem to be gold barred. Around the room sits 4 mirrors, glowing yellow. If you walk up to any of these mirrors, an option to take a synergy called Mirror will appear. Taking the synergy applies a nasty bleed to the synergizer and changes the color of the mirror. Changing all 4 of the mirrors so that they are all red will force the room to switch from light to dark, making the light adds damageable. Keep in mind that this bleed from the mirrors does stack. It ticks for over 5k a second at 1 stack, 10k at 2 stacks, and 15k at 3 stacks. And if you somehow survive long enough to take the 4th stack, it will just be a straight 1-shot, even to tanks. This type of damage is only seen on hard mode though. On regular vet, the dot is far less severe. This debuff lasts for 30 seconds. The room at the beginning of the fight needs to be swapped pretty constantly, so it's wise to assign 2 teams to handle the mirrors until the boss fight actually begins. These adds to start the fight do quite a bit of damage and do have cleave, so it's important not to get caught in front of the tanks here. The Crystal Hollow Sentinels only have a few attacks. Their light attack is called Quick Strike, their heavy attack is just called Heavy Attack, and applies a heal check if blocked successfully, debuffing the player with Rattled and Hindered. Rattled decreases damage done by 70%, and Hindered is a heal check that prevents the healing of missing health until the target receives about 40k in healing. If the attack completes but is unblocked and survived, the player will be debuffed with Devitalized, which decreases physical and spell resistances by 60%. If the attack is dodged or outranged, the mini will be buffed with Seethe, which increases their damage by 60% for 12 seconds. The final attack from the Sentinel is called Shield Throw. It mimics the same type of shield throw we've seen historically from Sentinel type adds. It is pretty much a one-shot if a DD gets caught in it unblocked, and will tick 2 total times, once on the throw and once on the return. Each tick does the near one-shot amount of damage and stuns any target hit and not blocking. The Crystal Atronox can add up in damage if not dealt with, though they are very easy to kill. They do a ranged light attack called Splintered Glass, and if left up for too long, will perform Shard Eruption, where they will spew shards at random allies for a pretty long period of time. This mechanic can only be interrupted if the Atro is chained, but none of the small adds in this fight are chainable while gold barred, making flipping the room quickly pretty important. Once you deal with the light adds, you'll meet the dark adds. Since the room is dark from killing the light adds, you'll have to flip the room a second time back to light in order to damage them. The Runok is the elite type add, and this is probably the most dangerous add in the encounter. Slice is its light attack, and it does apply a pretty severe bleed to the target hit. Frenzy is the heavy attack, and like the Sentinel, this heavy attack can apply Rattled and Hindered, Devitalized, or Seethed. Every so often, the Runok will stick its sword into the ground and spawn fire tornadoes called Dancing Flames that swirl in the spawn location until the Runok is defeated. These AoEs do a lot of damage and should be avoided to non-tank players. Bouncing Flames is an axe throw attack that occurs if you get too far away from the Runok. The ad will throw his axe at you and do damage on impact, followed by an AoE that drops onto the ground and explodes after a quick second. Getting caught in that AoE will do quite a bit of damage. Perhaps the Runok's most dangerous mechanic though is Whirlwind Dash. The Runok will spawn a circle under his own feet and do a slower whirling blades type animation forward in the direction that it's facing. This is a near one shot to damage dealers if caught inside, so it's important to have this facing away from the group to make sure the DDs don't get too close while focusing this ad. The other dark ad you'll encounter are the Gloom Shapers. These ads have a light attack called Flare and an interruptible channeled called Inferno that will shoot firebolts at random allies. This can tick surprisingly hard, so it's important to interrupt them whenever possible. This channeled ability from the small ad can be bashed, unlike the Crystal Atro channel ability. After killing the second wave of trash, you'll get a final wave that encompasses one of each elite type ad and two of each smaller type ad. Here you can focus the Runok and the Gloom Shapers, flip the room back to dark, and then kill the Sentinel and Atros. After all ads are done, make sure everybody backs up from the center. The main boss is going to explode out of its cage and stun anyone caught in its radius. If anyone gets caught, the boss fight will automatically start. You'll need to flip the room one final time to make the boss damageable at the beginning of the fight here. And with that, the main boss, the Orphic Shattered Shard. Now this boss alone really doesn't do too much. In fact, not any one enemy really has more than one or two truly punishing mechanics. What makes this fight tricky is all of the mechanic combos that can line up. So with that, let's discuss the boss mechanics. Then we'll go over the fight mechanics and a flow of fight example. The Orphic Shattered Shard's light attack is called Surprise Quick Strike, and its heavy attack is called Heavy Strike. This heavy attack applies Hindered and Rattled, or Devitalized, or Seethed, depending on how it's handled. It's pretty important not to enrage this boss, as it does have some pretty punishing group mechanics, the main one being Shockwave. The boss will hold his club into the air and slam it into the ground a few seconds later. You'll notice a crystal formation at the point of impact. In a second after the slam, a giant Shockwave AoE will spawn from the center of that crystal formation, starting as a tiny AoE, but growing in size dramatically as it travels outward. This does a ton of damage, and getting hit by this as a damage dealer plus literally any other mechanic at all is enough to kill you. You can block or roll this mech, but our group has found that the safest thing to do is to have the main tank call out Slam or Kite, and then everybody knows to just back up. There are some risks related to the mini boss Zoran, which we will discuss shortly doing this, but the other benefit to kiting outwards is that the boss usually follows with the Shard Volley attack. The Shockwave and Shard Volley seem to coincidentally line up most of the time, but this will not always be the case. Shard Volley targets 9 players, seeming to favor targets furthest away from the boss within a certain radius, much like the Sunburst mechanic on Onsel, sending out an AoE that does a big tick of damage on impact, and creating an AoE when it lands that does a lot of damage over time if you're standing in it. These are relatively easy to avoid and shouldn't have to be prioritized too much, especially if the group is used to kiting out for the slam, which will then place them naturally out of group when the Shard Volley AoE spawn. At 90, 60, 40, and 15%, the boss will perform the Shield Charge and Shield Formation mechanics, assuming that he is already not in the center of the room, which will create a giant red carpet on the ground and 3 distinct crystal shields around the boss. The boss charges to the center of the room, first doing damage with the carpet, and then sending out the crystallized shields once he gets to the center that continue down that path until they reach the edge of the arena. Getting hit by either the AoE or the lesser animated crystals will do a ton of damage and must be avoided. Note that you will only see this mechanic if the boss is not in the center of the room at the given percentage thresholds. Again, 90, 60, 40, and 15. Once the boss is in the center of the room and at these thresholds, he will channel Incandescent Destruction. Tethers will latch out onto the mirrors from the boss, and a slow growing AoE will appear in the center of the room. If the mech is not completed correctly, the boss will instantly wipe the entire group. In order to prevent this, each mirror must be synergized a single time. The tether from the boss to the mirror will disappear once the mirror has been hit. Once all mirrors are hit, the boss will fully finish the channel and instead hit the group with lesser Incandescent Destruction, which still does a little bit of damage but doesn't wipe the group. The last note with this mechanic is that at each of these phases, one more time, 90, 60, 40, and 15, you'll get ad spawns that correspond with the current color of the room. So at 90, you'll get 3 Crystal Atros and a Sentinel. At 60, you'll get 3 Gloom Shapers and a Runok. At 40, you'll get the light ads again. And at 15, you'll get the dark ads again. Note that these ads do spawn in random and varying locations, and they come out swinging. They're hard to see, and damage dealers are probably going to have to be aware of and roll dodge these as necessary, especially because they spawn on the edge of the arena near where the damage dealers will be going to hit their mirrors. It feels like a little bit of a trolly mechanic, but there are ways to work around it, which we'll discuss in the walkthrough. Once this is complete, the final mech that the boss casts is color change. The boss will initially change from a dark type ad into a light type ad, making it necessary to flip the room from light to dark in order to damage the boss again. This entire process repeats at each of the given percentage thresholds. Again, 90, 60, 40, and 15. At 90 and 60%, 2 more mirrors will spawn in after the channel is complete. At 90% after the channel, a mirror spawns on both the left and right side of the arena, and the boss flips these mirrors to be the opposite color of the room once they spawn in. You must wait for the mirrors to spawn and for them to be the opposite colors of the mirrors around them before you go over to synergize them. Otherwise, the room will not change colors properly. After the 60% mechanic, the final 2 mirrors spawn in directly on entrance and directly across from entrance. For whatever reason, these mirrors seem to spawn in the opposite color already, so they are immediately available to be hit, though this may get fixed one way or the other when the fight goes live. This leaves a total of 8 mirrors that need to be hit at 40 and 15% in order to avoid the group wipe. Any mirror left unsynergized results in a wipe. The final mechanic related to the main boss is the Fate Pillar. Starting at 80%, the boss will summon a glass eyeball looking structure called a Fate Pillar. This ad will attach a beam to 4 or 5 players that does a very small amount of damage over time, but eventually one-shots if the eyeball is not destroyed in time. In order to destroy the Fate Pillar, the boss must be dragged over to it, with the tank placing the Shockwave Slam AoE directly on top of the eyeball. Doing so will shatter the Fate Pillar and break the tether. On regular vet, the boss will give you 2 chances to do this correctly, but on hard mode, you only get 1, and it happens fast, so the tank has to be ready in anticipating this mechanic. The very last source of damage that you take throughout the fight is from Zoran, the mini-boss. Zoran can wreak a bit of havoc, but is relatively easy to deal with if you understand his mechanics. Zoran is only ever a light type ad, so he will only be damageable when the room is dark. He has a medium amount of health, sitting at about 14 mil on hard mode. Zoran's light attack is called Shock. The heavy attack is called Heavy Shock, and this is a channeled heavy that ticks every half second for 3 seconds, doing a steady and small amount of damage over the channel, followed by a big burst of damage at the end called Lightning Burst. Lightning Burst is done in an AoE radius around the targeted players, so anybody too close to the off tank will get one shot. The boss won't move during this channel, so the off tank could simply run away from the group if needed. However, failing to block the actual channel portion of the heavy will result in taking a ton of damage. Every so often, the boss will target the player with aggro with Lightning Flood. This is a conal that will move its positioning based on the current positioning of the player with aggro. This is a one-shot to damage dealers if taken unblocked, and if it ends up in group, I'd suggest roll dodging it. Zoran's final attack is Thunder Thrall. The boss will port to the furthest player away and cast Thunder Thrall, a quick and large growing AoE that is a one-shot to any non-tank player if unblocked on hard mode. Following the explosion, 4 smaller AoEs appear in an X pattern called Lightning Arc, which again can near one-shot players if taken unblocked. If the boss ports to group for whatever reason, it's wise for a block callout to be made so that it doesn't catch any of the damage dealers off guard. Zoran will teleport away once the boss reaches 20%, and instead 2 Runoks will spawn. On hard mode, you'll also get an additional Runok that spawns at 15% during the incandescent destruction phase. We found that the best thing to do is just have the off-tank kite all 3 of these Runoks around until the boss is killed, especially since they shouldn't have a mini-boss to worry about anymore. Keep in mind, getting touched by even the light attacks will apply multiple stacks of bleeding and give your off-tank a really bad time, so it's super important for the off-tank not to get hit by any of these attacks and to seriously just maintain aggro and stay as far away from them as possible. The only attack that you'll have to worry about being hit by is the Bouncing Flame Axe Throw, which if you just use a shield like Soul Burst, for example, won't be a problem at all. Alternatively, if you really want to, technically the room will be light to finish the fight, so you can stack all 3 of the Runoks in the center and ulti dump, but the boss has such little health at this point, I really feel it's not worthwhile. So now that we know all of the mechanics, let's discuss a few tricks before looking at a walkthrough of the fight and all of these mechs in action. The first main point to discuss revolves around mirrors. You will certainly want to assign damage dealers to a specific mirror number. Having to hit 2 mirrors as a damage dealer is very manageable on regular vet, but a near death sentence on hard mode. and you are debuffed with Mirror Drain for 30 seconds. Luckily, throughout the fight, there are only up to 8 mirrors, which means that you can easily assign a DD to each. How you choose to number them is up to you. The numbering system that I like the most is to label the entrance mirror as 1 and then to move clockwise with the final mirror to the right of entrance being labeled 8. This way, the first 4 mirrors are 2, 4, 6, and 8. This is nice for the ad phase, since you will be switching the mirrors very quickly, which requires that you assign 2 teams to alternate switching the first 4 mirrors. The people assigned 1, 3, 5, and 7 can simply hit 2, 4, 6, and 8 respectively when the callout odds is made, and the people assigned 2, 4, 6, and 8 can just hit their mirrors when evens is called out. The other way that you can number the mirrors is the way that I started this fight doing, labeling the mirrors as they spawn. So the first 4 are 1, 2, 3, and 4, numbered left to right, entrance to exit. The next 2 mirrors that spawn in are 5 and 6, that is left to right. The final 2 that spawn in are 7 and 8, entrance to exit. I would call group 1 and group 2, group 1's numbers being 1, 2, 3, and 4, and group 2, those numbers being 5, 6, 7, and 8, to hit mirrors 1, 2, 3, and 4. Do what works best for you and your group. The only other strat component to this fight revolves around how you handle Zoran. We found it best to hold him out of group and to assign a Kite healer to catch the jumps. If Zoran ports far enough away from group, you don't really have to worry about the Thunder Thrall and Lightning Arc mechanics. However, Zoran seems to be able to be outranged. So if he does happen to port near group, the Kite healer should simply call out block and everyone will probably live if they block in time. Every time Zoran ports, the off tank and the Kite healer should trade places because the giant Lightning Flood Conal or the AoE heavy attack usually follows close by. And if the off tank gets to Zoran quickly, these can easily be placed out of group. And with that, let's take a look at a walkthrough of the flow of the fight, this time from a DPS perspective. So again, when we start the fight, you'll notice that it'll begin with 2 Crystal Hollow Sentinels and a few sets of those Crystal Atros. If you're the first mirror team in this trash pull, you can hug the wall very tightly to get to the back 2 mirrors if you want to hit them to start the fight. So we'll do that here with group 1, that being mirrors 1, 2, 3, and 4, hitting the mirrors to begin. Once the room is flipped to dark, the ads will be damageable and they'll be able to be ulted and killed. Remember to watch for the shield throw. It's important to make sure that the tanks are facing them in a consistent direction. Here we chose entrance, and it's important for the group to rotate into the center of the room if you do so. After the first set of ads die, the next set will spawn the 2 Runoks in the back of the room, and it'll be group 2's turn to hit the mirror, needing to make them all light. Once the room is light, the Runoks will become damageable. And again, same concept, make sure that they're facing in a set direction so that the group doesn't get hit by the whirlwind dash. Once this set dies, you will get 1 Runok and 1 Crystal Hollow Sentinel, in addition to some Crystal Atros and some Gloom Shapers. The Runok is already damageable, so there's no need to flip the room yet, but you can have Group 1 go hit 3 of the mirrors like we did here, and then have the last person hit that mirror when the Runok is dead. Once the room is flipped to dark, the Crystal Hollow Sentinel will be damageable. Remember, when this ad is low health, back up out of the center so that you don't get stunned from the boss and erroneously start the fight. Now, this boss will come out swinging, so as soon as he explodes, that tank needs to run in and get aggro immediately. Make sure that we get Group 2 to flip the room to light so that the boss is damageable, and we'll back up for the Shockwave, followed by the first Shard Volley. Here, our damage is pretty quick, so we're already at 90%, getting ready for the first Incandescent Destruction phase. The people labeled mirrors 1 through 4 will go hit there. We usually throw a barrier before we go to hit the mirrors, and a barrier as we get back in. During that 90% phase, you'll get the Crystal Hollow Sentinel that spawns in at a random location. The DDs need to make sure to pay attention to this because he does come out swinging, and it's hard for the tank to find and get aggro of it before he whacks somebody. Yet another reason we throw 2 barriers there. Now that the 90% phase is finished, mirrors 5 and 6 will spawn to the left and right. They'll change colors, and then we're able to hit them to flip the room back to dark so that the boss is damageable once again. Here at 80%, we'll get the final mechanic, our first Fate Pillar. We'll drag the boss over to the Fate Pillar immediately as it spawns because that slam does come out quickly. The tank will get it faced on top of the Fate Pillar, and we'll back up for the Kite mechanic. From here on out, the fight is rinse and repeat. All we have to do is keep an eye on Zoran and if he ports near group for those Lightning Arc AoEs, and to do the Incandescent Destruction phases as they occur. So the boss will approach 60% here. We'll get the Pillager barrier as he ports into the center. We'll get out of the middle because he is going to do that shield charge mechanic. And then mirrors 1 through 6 will go hit. During this phase, the Runok will spawn again at a random location. Make sure you hit your mirror and get back into the center for the second barrier as quickly as possible, because this Runok's attack does also apply a bleed. Now, after that 60% phase, we'll get mirrors 7 and 8 that spawn. And remember, you can hit them as soon as they spawn to flip the room so that the boss is damageable again. Here, we only have 20% to push the boss, so I believe that the Runok becomes the priority target. It's really easy to push the boss, and if you push it too quickly without the Runok getting killed, it's going to be invulnerable when you have to flip the room again. So the Runok is the priority here. We get the Fate Pillar right at about 50%, and this Runok's almost dead, so we can start focusing the boss once more. And here we have a good example of a Zoran cone in group. We get a port that's not too terribly far away from group, followed by a cone immediately facing group that we all have to roll dodge. In this POV, we're holding Zoran on top of the Orphic Shattered Shard, but again, I strongly advise that the off tank just run straight to Zoran whenever he ports, so that this cone in group doesn't happen. At 40% here, we'll get another barrier, and then everybody will go hit their mirrors. No more new mirror spawns here. We have everybody hitting 1 through 8. Now that there are no more new mirrors spawning, as soon as this phase ends, the boss will be damageable. So we'll drop our ultimates, and we will push the boss as quickly as we can to the last mirror phase at 15%. We have a lot of time to damage the boss and just simply cleave the sentinels, so we won't even make that a focus. Now that it's 20%, Zoran has ported away and the 2 Runoks are up. Again, make sure that the DDs are aware and roll dodge if necessary. We get a Fate Pillar here at roughly 18%, which gives us some time to overburn the boss until the boss does the Shockwave mechanic to destroy the Fate Pillar. We get them all the way down to about 8%. We'll get the last barrier. Everybody will hit their mirrors. And again, as soon as Incandescent Destruction finishes channeling, the room will flip and we'll be able to immediately kill the boss. We will get 1 more Runok during this phase. Either tank can grab it. Ideally, the off tank that's just kiting these around in a circle has it. And remember, for that off tank, just make sure that you maintain aggro on these Runoks and kite in a circle. Just don't get touched. You're going to get stacking bleeds. You're going to get stacking heavy attacks. It's way better to just take the ranged bouncing axe mechanic that they do, as opposed to face tanking them head on, especially so that the healers can focus on the group for this last bit of damage that everyone's going to take. And now, getting into the grand finale of the trial, we go straight from boss 2 to boss 3. This final boss is quite possibly one of the coolest fights conceptually I've seen in a long time. This fight is a beast on so many levels, but can be made pretty easy, especially if you're simply going for a hard mode clear. Up to this point, if you've been keeping up with the quest, you'd know that you're racing Zoran to try to get your hands on the Arcane Knot, an artifact relevant to Kashargo for one reason or another. After defeating the second boss, the Arcane Knot spawns and is actually the central mechanic to the final boss fight. According to the NPCs, the Arcane Knot is too heavy to simply walk out with. Rather, you and your group must carry this artifact together all the way back through Lucent Citadel, confronted by Zoran in what we thought was simply the first room of the trial, in a spectacular you shall not pass style finale. Now, obviously, as you walk back through the trial, you'll be faced with many different types of enemies. I'm going to break this fight down room by room so that you have a good idea of what to expect and how to handle it. But first, let's take a look at some of the primary mechanics that you need to worry about throughout the course of the entire fight. Throughout the entire encounter, there are 3 main mechs that you will be dealing with: the Arcane Knot, the Crystal Atronox, and the Defense Prisms. The Arcane Knot, as mentioned, is what the fight centers around. To start the fight, a player interacts with the knot and 6 yellow circles pop up around it. Players must synergize on these circles to start the fight. The knot is too heavy to carry alone, and leaving the knot all by themselves will dramatically slow that player down, with a stacking stair that ramps up depending on how many necessary players are missing from the dome. You'll need at least 5 extra people within the dome to get the knot to move at a regular pace. Any less than that, and anybody caught inside the dome, including the player holding the knot, will become snared the less people that are present. This can slow down the fight dramatically, so it's important that the group stays with the knot. Whoever is holding the knot is inflicted with a dot that ramps up over time, an effect called Temporal Splinters. Holding the knot also applies a pretty gnarly healing debuff that decreases healing done by about 20%. A player may only hold the knot for 60 seconds on regular vet and 45 seconds at a time on vet hard mode. Once that timer reaches the last 5 seconds of its duration, the damage from the knot has ramped up pretty severely and requires focused healing. Everybody gets a combat cue on their screen with the text reading, "The Arcane Knot is fracturing," followed by a 5-second slow-growing AoE that starts from the center of the knot and extends to be just a little bit wider than the radius of the visible dome. The player holding the knot cannot avoid getting hit by this AoE, but the other players can. The AoE does a very small amount of damage, but is mainly relevant in applying the fracture debuff. This debuff lasts for about 2 minutes on regular vet, but 8 minutes on vet hard mode, requiring a 12-man knot rotation on hard mode to succeed in this fight. Once this has completed, the arcane knot is loose and must be picked up with another player by hitting the standard interaction key. Failure to pick up the knot in 5 seconds will cause it to cast Arcane Storm, spewing shards from the loose knot that ramp up quickly to be one-shot ticks in just a couple of seconds. These can be roll dodged, but you will not survive long. If a player that is already fractured attempts to pick up the knot, they are instantly killed, picking up the knot and taking a tick of damage from it that causes them to die immediately. Every time the knot is dropped, whether it be a player death or whether it be the timer expiration, a Crystal Atronach spawns. The Crystal Atronach is the tank buster of the fight. As time goes on, the Atros that spawn become more powerful than the previous, having more health and dealing way more damage. An unblocked light attack from this monster can hit a tank for 60k relatively early on. Deaths with the knot can result in multiple Atros spawning, which can quickly overwhelm the tanks. This fight moving smoothly depends on getting the Atros off the board as quickly as possible, while only ever focusing them as the absolute last priority. It's a really interesting balance to attempt to strike. The Crystal Atro performs both Crystal Spear and Crunch, its varying light attacks, as well as crushing shards, its devastating heavy attack that can one-shot a tank with 40k HP if not shielded in the later stages of the fight. Perhaps the most dangerous mechanic from this ad though is Splintered Burst. This places a growing AoE on the player with aggro that again can one-shot a tank through block if not shielded, and should probably be roll dodged unless the tank is an Arcanist with Impervious Rune Ward. Any damage dealer caught anywhere near this AoE should simply roll dodge to be safe in my experience. Tanks would be wise to try to keep this AoE out of group and roll it into walls as often as possible, since it is a bit desynced and can pretty easily catch anyone off guard with sporadic movement. These AoEs do not disappear until the Source Atro is killed and will do damage via splintered shards to anyone caught in the AoE. Again, in the later stages of the fight, this can tick non-tank players for a ton and should be avoided altogether. The cast that the Atro does is called Unwritten Shift. It's a port mechanic when the player with aggro gets too far away. Maintaining aggro on these Atros can be a little tricky though with how slow it moves and how much running throughout this fight is required. It has a pretty long cooldown as well. The Atro seems to prefer to run as opposed to port to catch its targets, which makes it even harder to keep good time on target. The final universal targets seen throughout the entire fight are the defense prisms, those crystals that you've seen throughout the entire trial. If you thought, man, I bet those will be important later, you sure were right. In each room you encounter, there will be a barrier that prevents you from walking into the next room. To get rid of this barrier, you must destroy the crystals. The catch is that these crystals have to die within 10 seconds of each other on hard mode, or they will respawn. The window to kill these on vet is much wider, I believe closer to 15 seconds. On regular vet, these crystals only have about 3 million HP, but on hard mode, they have about 5 million. While the crystals are active, they will track a couple of players with detonation AoEs. Small AoEs that spawn in groups of 6 that follow the movement of a player, much like the kite mechanic in Vass. They are very slow to animate and land, so they should be pretty easy to avoid. And we have yet to deem it necessary to have players that are being tracked by this mechanic to kite it out of group per se. It's pretty much just a see and don't get hit by the red mech. And with that, the actual fight. As soon as the knot is picked up, you'll run down the same set of stairs that brought you to the second boss. To greet you is a Manticora. Now this enemy doesn't do much, however it will troll you. Everybody gets ported into the fight randomly and one at a time. So if your tank is one of the last ones ported in, you'll either need to wait and let them run ahead or plan on timing out a roll dodge. If everyone runs down the stairs together, that Manticora will just snipe somebody before it's able to be taunted. It only has 2 attacks, the Lustrous Javelin, its ranged attack, and Glazed Backhand, its melee attack. These attacks are one-shots to damage dealers, but don't do much to tanks when blocked. I'd suggest simply carrying this target with you and just cleave it down, placing it on top of defense prisms to do so. Likewise, we're introduced to the little skeleton ads that will annoy us throughout the entire encounter. These ads really do not do any damage and are not worth focusing in any capacity. They do slash as their light attack and rending slashes as some sort of medium attack, but the only real relevant thing worth noting is that getting hit by these skeletons can snare you or slow you down. Again, not something to actively avoid, but just something to kind of more or less be aware of depending on the situation that you find yourself in. In the second room, you'll encounter the first defense prism. Simply focus this and cleave the Manticora as much as possible. The Manticora does move slowly, so you might not kill it here, and that's okay. Just move to the next room once the crystal is finished. In the third room, we'll again only see 1 defense prism. You'll notice 4 different exit points into the next room. The prism will spawn randomly in front of one of these exit points, and once destroyed, will only open up 1 path. That is, the barrier that it's adjacent to. Depending on your speed, you'll likely have your first knot fracture here, especially on hard mode, so make sure the group is staying with the knot. Likewise, in this room and the next, you'll encounter a familiar foe, the Arcane Sentry. These mimic the eyeballs that spawn on the main boss rounds in Infinite Archive, targeting players with Brilliant Ray. This AoE does a lot of damage and ramps up in damage quickly, so it's extremely important to avoid it. They seem to spawn in pairs of 2 and will target players somewhat randomly. Taking damage from the AoE seems to change its targeting to the player that it damages. It will track the pathing of this target, moving for a couple of seconds and pausing for a couple of seconds, on and off until the mini-boss in the next room is defeated. And with that, the 4th room will be our first encounter of a mini-boss. In this room, you're confronted with 2 defense prisms and Dario Lemons. This mini-boss doesn't have a lot of health and is pretty easy to deal with. His light attack is called Quick Strike and his heavy is called Uppercut. The heavy applies Rattled, Hindered, Devitalized, or Seethed depending on how it's handled. Every so often, the boss will cast Shard Shield, which puts a damage shield worth about 25% of the boss's health on himself. Powerful Throw is a cast that looks kind of like Uppercut, but once complete, the boss will vanish and leave an AoE on the ground based on the location of the target the ability was casted on and reappear at that location. You can use this ability to restack the boss quickly on a different crystal for speed strats. This is a one-shot to anybody caught in the AoE, so it's important to be avoided. Finally, the most dangerous mechanic this mini-boss possesses is Arcane Conveyance. The boss will cast this ability on the knot holder and the player furthest away from the knot. The player furthest away will have their screen turn blue, and once the screen goes back to normal after about 2 seconds, a yellow tether will appear between them and the player holding the knot. Much like Coral Airy, anybody caught with this tether will get straight one-shot. So with that, in dealing with this room, you can approach it in one of 2 ways. The strat oriented towards the speedrun would most likely be focusing the crystals. Start the mini-boss on the crystal to the right, then have the group damage the crystal until it's at about 1 million HP and move to the next. The tank should be able to get the boss to port to the next crystal via the powerful throw ability if they move quick enough. The group should ulti dump the second crystal, fully kill it, and then turn and finish the crystal that they came from if needed, and then finish the mini-boss. Remember, the crystals need to die within about 10 seconds of each other. My group's progressing this on the PTS tried a couple of variations, and we found this to by far be the quickest. We tried simply ignoring the crystals and nuking the mini first before the tether even came out, which is for sure the safest way to do the fight. We also tried splitting the group 6 and 6 to kill each crystal, but we found it far faster to just keep the group and all of the buffs and debuffs together, centered on one main target at a time. So for all of these rooms, if you're going to do anything, I'd consider the speed strat being to focus the crystal while cleaving any target alive, and then to finish any mini boss after the crystals are dealt with. And the safe strat being to nuke everything in the room first, then handle the crystals. The only other group coordination to concern yourself with involves the tether. We found it best to put the knot in the space near the exit barrier and to have the damage dealer face their backs to the adjacent staircase, while damaging the first crystal to be near the knot, while having a healer kite way off into a corner behind the second crystal to bait and catch the tether. Once the tether is live, the healer would simply run to and stack on top of the knot carrier, while the group avoided that area altogether. The tether lasts for about 10 seconds, and it will not go away when the mini-boss dies, so you have to have some awareness as a damage dealer here. At this point, you can start making some decisions about the crystal atros for your group. In general, I would advise getting comfortable with never having to stop to kill these, especially if the trifecta is your goal. That means that both, the tank will have a little bit more pressure, but also means that your group should really emphasize on cleaving these atros down when an opportunity presents itself. It's very doable to leave almost every room without an atro, without having to stop to focus any. That said, if you're doing a slower and safer strat, it is far safer to just leave each room without an old atro. Keep in mind that slowing this fight down can pretty easily make Zorn a much more complicated fight though, so do with that what you will. I would never ever stop to focus a brand new atro though if it spawns while you're moving or at the end of a room. Simply kill any old atro that you might have active. Once you get to the 5th room, you'll encounter a familiar foe, Count Ryelaz resurrected with about half his initial health, but this time under the name Baron Rise. This boss does all of the same mechs as seen in the first boss room: Rend, Swipe, Shear, and Slash, as well as Twin Strike Sunder. Remember, Twin Strike Sunder is the meteor mechanic, and this time 11 players will be targeted, that is, everyone but the player furthest away from the boss. I'd suggest the furthest player being the one to hold the knot, so that they don't take extra damage. The meteors occur pretty frequently, so I'd suggest doing a traditional maw stack for this boss fight, to have the DD spread out, so as not to overlap meteors and accidentally kill one another. Once this boss is defeated, only the middle pad will transport you to the next room. Moving into room number 6, which we'll call the Necro room, you'll notice one of 2 hallways of terror. These are guarded by Lucent sentries, which look like the glass orbs that we're used to. They will do a 3-second summoning animation where a rectangle forms from left to right, followed by a 3-second yellow beam. This beam does a ton of damage and is practically a one-shot to non-tank players. You can roll dodge through these though, so I'd get in the habit of attempting to not stop stop here and just keep running and rolling. Note that occasionally these do seem to desync for whatever reason. If you're running through this hallway and you don't see an animation for a few seconds, just know the beam is about to come out and you won't really know exactly when. So I would roll through where these are going to be just to be safe. And with that, getting into room number 6, this is a 3-part room. Part 1 involves a defense prism that rotates around the room in a clockwise fashion. Once this prism is defeated, the next section will be unlocked, where you will be confronted with 8 necromancers and an untouchable mini-boss named Mizralnir, a giant skeletal colossus that you can see at the base of the room, mimicking the one from Unhallowed Grave. This is one of the most dangerous rooms in the encounter. As long as the necromancers are alive, Mizralnir will cast a mechanic called Necrotic Rain, which will target all 12 players with a small AoE, dealing a strong amount of damage per tick and applying a very small heal check with the 3rd and 5th ticks. This damage does stack, mimicking the Starfall mechanic on the final boss of Helras Citadel, so it's important for the group to stay somewhat spread out, but also in healing. Mizralnir will also cast Necrotic Barrage on one player with the Knot, a giant AoE about half the size of the dome that is sent out as a skull, and will one-shot players caught in it on land. This cannot be roll dodged, but it can be blocked and is only a hard mode mechanic. The necromancers themselves are very finicky, sending one of the tanks on a mission to get soft aggro of all of these necromancers and to get them stacked quickly and cleanly is the entire progression of this room. The necromancers themselves have only 3 casts: the Necrotic Spear, which is their light attack; Induce Horror, where they send a ghost towards a player that it's aggroed to, stunning anybody caught in its path; and Necrotic Ritual, which are additional small AoEs that don't do too much damage sent out at players. When it comes to actually dealing with this room, it's really all going to depend on your tank getting these necros stacked quickly and cleanly. There is a weird tendency for the necromancers to reset, especially the very last one, if you're not quick enough. Speed is key for the tank here, and for that reason, I recommend that they run 3 Swift on this fight, as well as a skill like Race Against Time, so that they can get back in quick enough to not only prevent the furthest necro from de-aggroing, but also to catch a Blood Altar, since they'll take quite a bit of damage from the Necrotic Rain running back. To help out, we throw a Pillager Barrier when the floating prism is at about 3 mil HP, and then rotate 2 barriers each Necrotic Rain phase. Likewise, you'll want the Knot to stay somewhat out of group to kite the skull AoEs away, as anybody caught in this AoE will be instantly killed. The soft aggro of the necromancers are very sensitive, so to ensure a good stack, you don't want any abilities from any other players accidentally hitting a necromancer as they walk up the stairs. Otherwise, you risk the OT losing soft aggro. In addition to this, the first damage dealer to make it over to the necro stack when it's time to kill them will typically pull aggro of any necromancer that is not hard taunted, resulting in a barrage of light attacks that wipe the player out. So it's probably wise to have some sort of barrier or gibbering active once it's time to move over. While the necros are being stacked, your group can use this time to catch up on and kill some ice atros, again, being careful to face your cleave away from the stairs so as not to tarnish the stack. A clean necro room plays a major factor in a clean final boss fight. This room can easily extend your fight time by minutes if not done properly, which will cause complications in the final room. Once the necros are all dead, you can move into phase 3 in this room. If the Necrotic Rain is still active when the necros die, it will continue to animate, but it will cease to do damage. You can tell that all of the necros are dead once all of the giant blue skull AoEs dissipate. In this final phase, you'll have 3 connected crystals, all of which must die 10 seconds apart on hard mode. To do this, I'd suggest starting on the entrance crystal at the bottom of the stairs, getting it to about 20 to 25%, then move all the way to the end of the bridge, skipping the middle crystal for now, get that one to 20 to 25% as well, and then have everybody drop ultimates and lay a couple of dots like wall and caltrops, for example, on the center crystal, and then split up into 2 groups once the middle crystal is at about 50 to 60%. Focusing the middle crystal last leaves the quickest possible route for the groups to get back to the entrance and far crystals, and dropping ults in the center allows the group to leave far earlier so that this one gets finished off by cleave, while the split groups finish off the entrance and far crystals with spammables. We divided the groups into the same ones that made the Ash Titan and Scorpion teams on first boss. Scorpion side went to finish entrance, and Ash Titan side went to finish the far crystal. Once done correctly, I'd suggest moving to the base of the hallway and finish any ice atros that you might have active until a fresh knot fracture. After moving through another hallway of terror, you'll approach room 7, the final mini-boss room. Here, you'll encounter 4 total defense prisms and 2 mini-bosses. The defense prisms are linked in groups of 2, so you only need to kill the entrance ones within 10 seconds of each other, and the exit ones within 10 seconds of each other. Here, you can treat the mini-boss like we did in the first mini-boss room, having the group focus the entrance crystal while stacking everything on the left side, ulti dumping that set and killing the mini-bosses there. Or you can take a safer approach and stack the mini-bosses in an area with more space, kill them there, then focus the crystals. What you choose to do is up to you and your group preference. but as always, stacking the bosses on a crystal will always be faster. The mini-bosses that you will encounter are Drezacel and Zinzada. Drezacel is a one-handed shield humanoid target and the least dangerous of the two. This mini performs Quick Strike for its light attack, as well as Low Slash as a medium attack, which applies Hamstrung, a speed debuff. Power Bash is a standard heavy attack, and Shield Throw is an AoE mimicking that of the Sentinels from the second boss, and should therefore be faced away from group. This mini-boss comes out swinging, so be aware of that. The first mech that he does is Low Slash, and this will one-shot a non-tank player. The other mini-boss, Zinzada, will perform Crystal Bolt as her light attack with no distinct heavy. Vitrify is a low damage dealing interruptible mechanic, however the player targeted will take stacks of a snare if the channel is not interrupted, which will dramatically slow the player down, making the fight much more dangerous since getting out of damage in this room is mostly the key to survival. Crystal Burst is a mechanic where the mini will place 4 AoEs on random players that will explode in ice damage. It doesn't really do much, but it can add up if you take multiple AoEs from either that mechanic or the detonation AoEs from the crystals as well. The most dangerous mech that is even a one-shot to tanks, however, is Piercing Beam, a mechanic mimicking the beams from the Terror hallways. This boss applies the mechanic in the direction that she's facing, so again, it's important to ensure that she's not facing group. This mage is also considered a range target, so it must be stacked as such. Once these mini-bosses are defeated, you'll handle the crystals much like in the first mini-room. Start on entrance, get a crystal to 1 mil, fully kill its counterpart, and then turn and finish the first one as necessary. Repeat on the exit set of crystals. Once the barrier is gone, I'd suggest moving into the next room for a bit more space and wait here to start the final room on a fresh knot. This is imperative to ensure that fracture doesn't happen in an inappropriate moment during one of the mechanics that we will discuss shortly that forces the group to separate. And with that, the final room of the fight introduces Zoran, the main boss of the encounter. This boss only has 3 mechanics, all of which are incredibly punishing. The first mechanic that you will see is the heavy attack. This is a 2-part attack that ramps up in damage over time, dealing a ton of damage, finishing with an attack called Chain Lightning. The actual channel of the heavy is called Accelerating Charge, and the final tick on the tank is called Powering Lightning. This ramps up in damage over about 3 seconds with that massive tick at the end. Chain Lightning will start on the tank and tick to each player within proximity of the tank, and can hit for upwards of 30k to non-tank players if unblocked. Blocking this attack with good mitigation will bring its damage down to a much more reasonable 10 to 12k tick. We found that rotating barriers for every heavy attack is the easiest way to handle the mech. You don't have to block at all if you have a barrier. As a note, it takes about 2 or 3 seconds for Chain Lightning to reach every player. This means that usually you're going to have to block for a couple of seconds if you don't have a barrier to guarantee your life. Or what I see much more commonly is if Chain Lightning is going off and somebody has just resurrected you, you're going to want to wait a few seconds to get up before you know that Chain Lightning has stopped bouncing between people. The heavy attack applies a debuff to the tank, which makes taking another heavy attack a one-shot. As a note, once the boss begins channeling the heavy attack, he will not switch targets, even if the other tank gets aggro, so it's important to swap pretty soon after each heavy. After the first heavy attack finishes, the next mechanic that you'll get is Fluctuating Current. This mechanic is single-handedly the only reason that this fight is so difficult on hard mode. On regular vet, this mech only lasts for 30 seconds, and while it does ramp up dramatically in damage, it doesn't have a straight one-shot component. On hard mode, however, holding this lightning cage for more than 15 seconds results in a 270k one-shot. In addition to this, the longer you hold the current, the more damage it will do to you. The tick at 15 seconds is around 15k. The current itself on hard mode lasts for 60 seconds, which means that at minimum, it must be traded between 4 players. However, that would assume perfect timing, which is pretty impossible to achieve due to the next mechanic, which forces the group to split up. So we found that a 12-second 5-player rotation is probably the best way to handle this mech. The final component to Fluctuating Current is that it places a debuff on you that lasts for about 90 seconds that makes touching the current again a one-shot. This current spawns once every roughly 62 seconds and is active for 59 to 60 seconds. So if the current is 60 seconds long, spawning once every 60 seconds, and you have a 90-second debuff that makes touching it again a one-shot, the most efficient way to do this fight statically is to have 2 teams of 5, that is current team number 1 and current team number 2, that will alternate and perform the mechanic every other current. On PC, there are some fantastic add-ons that help players manage the current timing. However, for base UI on console, all we get is a debuff that tells us the total time remaining on the current. The most efficient way to handle this is for players to track that debuff and simply call out once they've held it for 10 seconds, and for the next person to come grab it off of them. We've also found a pretty decent way to line up mechanics to trade the current in a relatively static fashion. After the first heavy, player number 1 steps out of group to catch it. The second player will grab it as soon as the lines become visible for the first mirror mechanic. It is essential that you hold off on trading this current for as long long as you possibly can so that it lines up really nicely with the next few trades. If done correctly, the third person will be able to take right after the second chain lightning, the fourth person will be able to take right after the third chain lightning, just before the second mirror mechanic, and the final fifth person will be able to take immediately after the fifth mirror mechanic, only having to hold it for a couple of seconds. This mech is as complicated as it sounds and will be the majority of your prog on this fight. The final mech Zoran does is called Tempest Assault, what I've referred to as the mirror mech. Around the room, you will see 12 mirror spawns, and each will attach a line to a player. This line pivots at the point of origin and will move with the player. Each player can only get hit by their own line, as getting hit by two becomes a one-shot in the form of oblivion damage, which means that there's no way to survive it outside of performing the mech correctly. There are a few different strategies evolving to handle this mechanic currently, the most popular and consistent of which seems to be the straight line stack. Players are assigned a position in a line that moves from exit to entrance, and once set at that stack should move along their line, treating it like the Lothus cone in Asylum Sanctorum if they are still in two lines for whatever reason. With this stack, two line stacking should be a pretty rare eventuality, but the goal is to get all of the lines set quickly so that players can make the adjustments needed. The current should always be at the very back of the line so that nobody accidentally runs into it while moving into the stack. The second strat that I understand a little less is assigning players to set positions next to each of the mirrors in the room. Theoretically, the concept should be roughly the same, but there seems to be a bit more RNG involved in this stack. Players run to their position as quickly as possible to set their lines, and then move along them as needed to get out of two. In this stack, the current holder and the healer would remain somewhat in the middle and attempt to point their lines at entrance and exit, or straight at a mirror, where nobody should be, to ensure that the current remains in healing. It's not clear which strategy is the best just yet, and I'm sure that more and better ways will evolve to handle this mechanic in the future, but for now, this is what we have, and I would suggest attempting to mimic the first one. On hard mode, all 12 people get these lines, and on regular vet, only 5 to 6 get them. Finally, the key regardless of strat to clean mirror stacks is understanding the boss rotation. This boss has a perfect static rotation that never varies on exact timers. You walk into the room, the boss does a heavy attack, which we will call heavy 0, and then you can base the rotation around fluctuating current. So the boss will cast fluctuating current, then heavy number 1, then the mirror mechanic, then heavies number 2 and 3, then the mirror mechanic, then heavy number 4, and the rotation repeats from there. Current, heavy, mirrors, heavy, heavy, mirrors, heavy, repeat. Finally, once you kill Zoran, you'll notice that the fight is not over. To complete the story and the trial, you need to carry the arcane knot completely out of Lucent Citadel and deposit it in the special structure that Kshargo has built for it. A really cool and unique cherry on the top to finish off a phenomenal trial. And finally, I know that this was a ton of information, so let's go ahead and take a look at an example of the fight. This one from the healer point of view, brought to you by Rainsolo from Adrenaline, a group that is near the trifecta already. So we start this fight like any other, synergizing on the knot, making our way down the stairs, and getting ready to roll this Manticora right off the rip. A good roll dodge from the healer there means no deaths as we work our way into this first room. Here I like to get into Slayer stacks and drop a Colossus, make sure that we got Force, Slayer, and Vuln on this crystal. Killing these crystals quickly is the key to making it through this fight quickly. Second crystal, similar situation. We should get Archdruid here, as well as our first Knot Fracture coming up relatively soon. We'll get our first Knot Fracture on our way into the mini-boss, much quicker than most groups will probably be accustomed to, and we're getting ready for the tether. We'll stack the mini-boss on the crystal, again the crystals being the priority in this room. Use the boss mechanics to port him to the second crystal once it's time to start damaging it there. With the healers maintaining the tether out of group, the group making sure to stay away from the exit staircase, both crystals going down, and the mini-boss not too far behind afterwards. So we can see here that the boss ended up not porting to the far crystal for whatever reason, and the crystals are the priority, so getting those off the board and then focusing the mini is still the correct way to handle the situation, but it does end up losing us a little bit of fight time. The knot's going to end up fracturing in the hallway as opposed to the next room, which is definitely not preferable, but also not the end of the world. And with that, getting into this room, we're going to make sure that we're cleaving the only Atro that we should have up. All 12 getting the meteors here, except for one person, the furthest person away, of course. A good burn goal for this room is to try to kill Baron Rise in 2 meteor phases, which this group is well on pace to do. Second meteor phase goes out there right at 4%, and everyone leaning towards the middle pad now to get ported into the next room. Again, don't stop with the knot. Don't be afraid. Just try to get as far as you can with it. Again, remember to stay with the knot. This group is pretty well used to fracturing near the bottom of the staircase leading into the necro room here. So a couple of people having to run back and just make a couple of corrections, but staying with the knot is the absolute priority to make sure that they can run fast, stay in healing, etc. So moving into the necro room with the roaming crystal, we're going to kill this as quickly as possible, trying to face some cleave towards Atros, with that barrier going out about halfway through the crystal's health for the tank that's going to go stack the necros. Now that that crystal's dead and the tank's going to stack the necros, the group is going to focus any ice atro that they have up. Usually around this part, it'll be 2 ice atros, which we do see now, and the group being really careful to make sure that their cleave is not faced towards the stairs, so that the tank is guaranteed to have soft aggro of all the necromancers working their way up the stairs. Once the call out is made, the group is going to turn, probably drop Slayer, probably ulti dump this giant group of necromancers to try to kill it before the second necrotic rain mechanic. And they do get Necrotic Rain right at the last second, but this is fake because all the Necromancers are dead. We can tell because all of those Skull AoEs disappeared. We'll get another Knot Fracture here pretty shortly, and I like to have the other tank grab it here usually in the rotation because this 3 crystal portion takes a little bit of time, and one tank, especially if it's an Arcanist, can pretty easily handle all the Atros. So again, we'll get that Entrance Crystal to about 20%. We'll get this Far Crystal to about 20%, and then we will Converge on the middle, ulti dump it, and leave when it's at 40 to 50%, splitting into 2 groups to go finish the other ones, while the middle crystal dies to our dots and AoEs. Now that all the crystals are dead, we're going to work our way into the final mini-boss room. Trying to walk and do damage, trying to fracture either right outside of this hallway if you have to, or at the beginning of the next room if you're fast enough and can make it that far. Working our way through the hallway of terror to the mini-boss room, we're going to see the burn strat equivalent of this room, where we start on the entrance crystal, get it weak, stack the 2 mini-bosses on the opposite crystal, and ulti dump here. Again, the crystals are the priority. We saw a good play from the healer there with an Ice Atro loose, having to roll dodge the AoE. Having to roll dodge a heavy attack as well. This crystal finally going down. The group will turn and finish the other crystal. Then once both those are done, they'll focus the 2 Ice Atros and the mini bosses that they have active. Now that the minis are dead, they'll go to focus the last 2 crystals, again getting one weak, fully killing the other, then turning to finish the weak crystal. And a good goal here is to kill the crystals, move into the next room, and then move into the Zoran room on a fresh knot fracture if possible. This will make it line up so that the knot will never fracture during the mirror mechanic, the Tempest Assault, which can get really chaotic. And not necessarily never, but it definitely won't happen during the first 4 to 6 mirror mechanics, which are as many mirror mechanics as you should get before Zoran is dead. It's only 120 million HP. Killing this boss in 3 minutes is very feasible. So with that, the first heavy attack goes out, and the first fluctuating current getting ready to spawn on the furthest person away. That will be the POV that we're watching here, and you'll realize that the group is stacked on the entrance side of the boss, and that when we get into this first mirror mechanic, the players with fluctuating current are going to hold it at the very top of the line near the entrance, right on their number 12. The The first mirror mechanic is out, everybody's in a line, makes adjustments as needed, and the first knot is fracturing just after the mirror mechanic. The current traded off just in the nick of time there. That's player number 3. Player number 4 should attempt to grab it right after the next chain lightning. However, this player is unfortunately just going to dot out, just not catching some of the healing, unfortunately, as the second mirror mechanic spawns. So here, player number 4 should have the current and be holding it on 12. And then right after this mirror mechanic, player number 5 should get it and hold it for no more than 5 seconds before it disappears. But now the group is going to switch sides to the exit portion, and fluctuating current is now going to go to the other healer, who's going to hold it at position 1 on the exit door during the mirror mechanic. Swapping sides like this just makes it so that the currents can get to their spot easier without having to cross through the group and risk other players accidentally running into them. So now the second player is going to grab the current for the mirror mechanic. And now this next heavy attack is going to go out, and the third person on current team 2 is going to grab it. And then this last heavy attack is going to go out, and this is where player number 4 would grab the next current. And then player number 5 grabbing it right after this mirror mechanic. Again, as a reminder, we need 2 fluctuating teams, 2 groups of 5, because you have about a minute-and-a-half debuff. Once you've held the current, that makes picking it up a second time a one-shot. So the current lasts for 60 seconds. It's a minute-and-a-half debuff. To make this nice, static, and consistent, you essentially have to switch it off between 2 different teams to rotate through those 2 60-second timers. Now here it's going to be really, really close. Rain at 14 seconds, 15 seconds, and the boss dies just before the 270k one-shot. And all that's left to do is deposit the knot and move on with a pretty solid clear. Thank you so much, everybody, for checking out the video. If you're new to the channel and you found this guide helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below if you have any questions and just even what your favorite part of this brand new trial is. There are so many cool things to choose from. We have so many people to thank for making this video possible. Another huge shout out and thank you to Bethesda for sponsoring this video, and a massive shout out and thank you to all of the incredible people who made this video possible. There are over 30 people who took part in the recording runs and the clean walkthroughs to make this video possible. And it's because of people like this that make our community so special. So with that, another huge shout out and thank you to Rainsolo for not only providing the last boss POV, but also thank you to Rain, to Nilandia, and to Ambition for all the conversations, chats, and consulting to make sure that we really had every mechanic ironed out and as accurate as possible. A huge shout out and thank you to Proto Baggins for providing all of the graphics used in this video. And again, thank you to all of the raiders who took part in all of the runs to make this video possible. I have a list here. We have Arcane Storm, Chunkwunkerton, Sir Clydus, Elastic Pilot, Elrojoblanco, Faceheadmcgee, Rukia, FTRSoccer, Galactic Kitt, Groovy, Ryan is iffy, Ipal, Merican, JK Evolved, Kite, MiaMaria, Nilandia, Papayanoverlord, Phaft, Proto Baggins, Rainsolo, Hootex, Sparkle, Squeaky Bobble, Tagg, Triego, Reclaimer, Wheek, Bad Alaskan, and Yo Mr. White. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time and for your hard work. Finally, a special shout out and thank you to all of my current patrons: Clyde, Carla, Alberg, Larry, and Joseph. Thank you so much for your support. And thanks to all of you for all of your love and support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next one.